Hey guys, welcome to the feedback for the toughest exam in the Carrot Poker School. I hope you've had fun doing the grade 3 exam and felt like it was beneficial to your game, and now you're going to see me go over 9 sims. I'm not going to talk about a sim for one of the questions because it doesn't really require it, but apart from that, we're going to get our teeth into a lot of solver outputs here. And as always in the school, we're going to be explaining why things are the case and not just stopping at the what. Let's get started. Question 1 asked us how to handle the following turn barrel situation where our opponent in the hijack has fired a b33 and then subsequently a b75. We have to decide how 8-7 of clubs is playing here and why, explain the difference between calling and raising with Queen of Hearts, 9 of Hearts in EV, and then write a response to a student who posts a hand history where he calls the turn bet with Jack 9 of Diamonds. Finally, we're going to talk about the EV difference between calling and raising with 7s with a club and a spade in this spot. Let's pull up a sim and see what we've got here. The first thing we're going to do is have a look at this 8-7 of clubs and see just how it's handling this spot. What you see here is a subtree. So the reason that you can't actually see anything before the turn here is that this tree was actually locked so that villain's only sizing on the turn was b75, as you can see. I think this is a good thing to do when you're doing sims and just provides a cleaner output in general where you don't have a sub-range that no one's actually building in real life because people tend to just build one bet size. Here we have a b75, and if we locate our hand here, the 8-7 of clubs, we can see that we're mixing between call and raise. That means that both call and raise are going to be roughly the same EV. Obviously, any slight difference you see there at the bottom right of your screen is going to be due to accuracy and not something that we should really worry about. 8-7 of clubs, why is this hand able to raise? I guess this is the most surprising facet of this hand's play. This is your conventional hybrid. When this hand raises, a few different good things happen, but these aren't actually sufficient for saying that the hand is going to be a raise. While this hand is in some sense a value raise, in some sense a bluff, and in some sense a denial raise, it has to meet a certain caliber for each of those factors in order to get up to the point where raising is as good or better than calling as it is here. What we see is, and the best way to really understand hybrid raises, I think, is to look at our opponent's reaction to them and see where the benefits lie. So when we raise here, and this is about a 4x raise, something like this, we can see that we're getting folds from better hands immediately. So villain bet folding here with various combos of king 10, kings at some frequency. Anything that they think blocks our bluffs more heavily, they're going to be bet folding at the higher frequency here. That's just the way GTO is going to orientate itself. And then we have another facet here, which is that when we raise, we do actually have some elements of value present too. Value elements come in 2 shapes and sizes. Basically, you can get value in the sense that certain rivers are going to complete your hand. If we were to raise here, pick up a call and get a river that was extremely good for us, like an 8 was to come on the river, for example, we would now have a ridiculously high EV, jamming, value betting hand that's just going to be cleaning up huge amounts of the pot. If we look at the EV display here, we can see we're entitled to around 100% of the pot, and that's pretty fantastic. We're going to be able to make another bet and get called super frequently, so EV is understandably more than 100% of the pot here for us jamming the rest, because we're jamming slightly more than the pot. We're getting called a bunch of the time. This is a really good situation for our hand to be in when this happens. We can also make a straight, which is a bit less good, but it's still going to be a really profitable scenario. Then we come to the idea that part of value raising is actually getting value from worse hands immediately, and there aren't enough of those in villain's range for us to claim that this is a pure value raise, but it is a hybrid raise, because when we go ahead and raise here, villain is going to have various draws, like the ace-jack of hearts, for example, that are going to call. Now, if a brick comes on the river, just have a look at what happens here. So we raise, villain calls, and then the 3 of diamonds rolls off, and let's say that we don't decide to kamikaze jam this hand this time, let's say that we did check. We can see here that villain is supposed to bluff all of the time. With a hand like the ace-jack of hearts now, it's actually really low down their range. It's kind of the bottom thing that they could possibly have in the spot. However, that doesn't always happen in reality, so a nice exploitative benefit here is when people think they have, I guess, more check EV than they do compared to bet EV with a hand like this. The idea with this hand is that even though it's doing really well for villain by checking, it's even better if they turn it into a bluff because the fold equity is just going to be everything. We're not really meant to check all that river, we're meant to just keep value jamming, so the solver just always folds. So you might even get more EV in reality when people don't bluff you with those hands, but I guess we could say if we're always being bluffed by the ace-jack of hearts when it misses, is there really a sense in which we get value from that hand? Probably not, because we don't realize that equity, but the value element is very much coming from improving our hand to something that's going to win a huge pot, and it has a lot of outs to do that. I don't consider those part of the bluff reason for betting or raising, more of the value reason, because they equate to us winning a big pot sometimes. Hybrids have to be of a certain standard. They need to be of a certain vulnerability as well. They need to have good blocker properties in this spot. Because we're repolarizing, We don't just get to choose our hybrids with a really relaxed criteria. For example, pocket fives, you could say, oh, this is a hybrid, it's getting better hands to fold, it's able to make a boat sometimes, so that's a value element, and it's really vulnerable. This hand is too bad, it's just too low EV. So you just need to have stricter requirements for what you actually raise here when you're hybriding, so to speak. You can't just deem any hand a hybrid because you feel like it has to be up to the task, and the favorability of the landscape will help you determine how good this spot actually is and how selective you need to be given how well your range is doing. When you look at our EV here in the big blind, we're only entitled to 27% of the pot overall when we face this bet. And that's normal. When you face a turn bet, you're supposed to be on the rough end of things, like not doing fantastically. You have to fold a lot of your combos after all because they're entitled to 0 EV. Given your range is doing badly when your opponent's double barreling and polarizing, you do have to be selective with what hybrids you raise. So I would say here there's 2 real teaching points. 1, how to identify a hybrid hand, and 2, how to know how strict you need to be with that identification, because if we were just facing like a merged range bet on a flop here, we could be hybriding with much more lax standards. Let's move on to part B. Part B asks us to explain the EV difference between calling and raising on this node with the Queen 9 of hearts. So this is a hand that has a fairly big EV swing in the direction of raise being superior to call. And what's really happening here is that a hand like this is just unable to realize very much EV by calling because 1, it's out of position, which is going to really stifle the implied odds when we get there because we don't have the opportunity to donk lead the river. That's a part of our game that doesn't exist because it's just not beneficial for our range overall. That said, if we were able to donk lead the river, maybe this hand wouldn't suffer as badly by calling as it does here compared with raising, which is clearly superior. The other problem is that fold equity is going to be near impossible to realize as well when we simply call in this case. When we're out of position with a hand that's too good to fold, it's just entitled to too much of the pot based on its raw equity and its ability to make really good hands later, what we have to start doing is just raising because it's the only way to marry the hand's prowess and equity with fold equity and generate enough overall EV for this to be a viable continue. Calling is not losing though. It's important to understand here that if you were forced to either call or fold, you would still want to call. It's not that we can't call here in that sense. The reason we can't call is that raising is better and we don't want to take a line that's worse than an alternative. Part C, write a response to a student who posts a hand history where he calls the turn bet with Jack 9 of diamonds. Calling the turn bet with Jack 9 of diamonds, if you have this hand, which you're not actually meant to have from the flop, but if you did have this hand, it would be a huge leak to call here. You'd be throwing away, it looks like 25 chips in this case, which is about 2.5 big blinds. That's definitely something you're going to want to avoid. Why is this happening? This hand is, despite being a double gutter, very frail. It's unable to beat bluffs. It's not a bluff catcher, which means that if you call, you don't actually get to realize any fold equity later. Just the same problem with the Queen 9, only now you don't have enough equity to make raising clearly profitable anymore. Raising is not a big mistake here. If you go ahead and raise with any of these Jack 9 combos that aren't the heart draw, you can see that it's actually okay. You shouldn't really do it because it bloats your range towards air and makes it possible for villain to continue more frequently and start exploiting you. So if you unbalance your turn strategy, you do face theoretical future node exploitation on your opponent's behalf, but that's not really an issue in real time. So I don't really mind if the student was to raise this hand. The issue with calling is that while the equity is realizable, the fold equity and implied odds are less realizable being out of position. And if you just call here based on your equity alone, you clearly don't have anywhere near enough in the way of generous pot odds to make that a winning proposition. So this hand is just going to be far too loose on the flop and also too loose on the turn. Explain the EV difference between calling and raising with sevens. This is a hand that, while you could call it a hybrid because it's got a pair that's vulnerable, it's got some redraw, so some value element, and it's able to make some better hands fold by raising, it's not meeting the sort of strict criteria in this spot for hybrid selection. To select your hybrid raises on this node, you need to have more positive blocker properties than this. So what 2 sevens that are not on the board are going to do is firstly not block villain's value range as well. Hijack here won't have 9-7 anyway, so it's not really good to have a 7. There's no positive blocker property from that, so look out for the position of the opener here. This hand wouldn't be as bad a selection against button or someone that had 9-7. That would be a positive blocker. But the 7 is just going to block some bluffs as well. It's going to block some hands like Ace-7, King-7 suited, and it's definitely going to be a hand that doesn't block the value hands that the 8 blocks. Essentially, we just need to be more selective here when we're hybriding. We need to choose hands that not only have all 3 elements present, but also have positive and not negative blocker properties. So that's why this hand, while it's a good bluff catcher, a grade A bluff catcher, you could see being entitled to 1 big blind here by calling, That's not really relevant when it comes to raising. Raising, the bar is set higher, you're reopening the action, you're reinvesting over a polarized range, you just have to be more careful. That does it for question 1, let's move on. Question 2. This is a spot that is fairly tricky. It's a very wide range situation where there's minimal filtering and extremely bizarre texture. So this one is automatically just going to give you a reaction instinctively that's wrong a lot of the time, because this spot just doesn't fit the norm for how players get to this sort of situation normally, or the textural run out. You can expect your instincts to be a little bit off on some bizarre rare spots like this. Part A, how should you go about constructing a thought process for mixing whether to bet and how big to bet with the Queen Jack of Hearts? As the big blind player on this node, you've called the flop bet, turn has gone check check, you have the chance to bet river. Can you find 2 examples of value over bets for B150 that pool is unlikely to find, and why are these better than they look? I think people don't value bet thinly enough in this spot for big sizing, so why is that and what are they? And finally, explain why the solver never uses B400 here. Let's get into it. Essentially, what we have here is a river blunder theorem spot, to use the language from grade 2. Because big blind has filtered on the flop, they've moved a bit towards spades and just made hands in general, and they've moved away from hands like the 4 or 5 of clubs, which actually got there, but you get the point. Some other low disconnected hand like that small blind is still going to have in their range, but big blind is not. Let's say the king 5 of clubs, we're not going to have that, but villain will get to the river with that quite a lot. The conclusion then is that in this situation, because fold equity when we bet is going to be a bit above the pot odds norm, though I will say that 4 flush runouts in general tend to favour the preflop raiser due to their higher abundance of big offsuit cards and big pocket pairs, both of which profit a lot from the 4th flush card coming. However, the action sequence on the flop is just a strong enough factor here to render this a favourable world for in position. You can see that in position in the solver lands in this world with 70% pot share EV, which is absolutely mammoth. And so the in position player is going to want to bluff whenever they lack showdown value in this spot, like they do with Queen Jack. When we look at the EV of this hand, it is actually positive to check, because out of position does have to check down similar holdings sometimes, but it's better to bet because the fold equity is high. When we choose any sizing here, let's say B75, which is a size that would normally generate 42 to 43% fold equity in a neutral world, we're generating 65% fold equity here due to the favorability of having filtered flop towards stuff that likes this spot, basically. Our opponent has not done that. When you're in position and you call a flop bet and then it checks back on the turn and your opponent checks the river, you'll be in a really mandatory bluff spot in almost all runouts when you have air. Your range is condensed, you just don't have enough air that you would be over bluffing even if you bluff all of it. You have enough value hands that's completely fine, and you can't actually reach a bluff to value ratio here that's quote unquote balanced, because you just start with way too many good hands in your range and not enough bad ones due to that flop filtering. Sizing should be determined by an RNG here. Any size is actually okay. You have some thin value bets. If you look across your range here, you have like 2 pair that's block betting. You could probably do away with that and just check back most of those, although some of them seem to be EV losses not to block bet. When you block the ace but have a 9 high flush, you actually just want to make a small bet because you're blocking villains bluff catchers. That makes sense. The B75 is also being used with many combos, notably some bad flushes like pocket 5s with the spade, and the B150 is being used, the B400 is not. We'll get to why the B400 isn't being used in part C, but as we are working on bluff selection here and bluff sizing, the idea here is that because we have 3 different value bet sizes, we need to mix 3 different bluff sizes. But in general, we should err on the side of using the bigger ones and the ones that are most abundant in our range. The reason we should use the bigger ones is that they allow a higher bluff to value ratio based on the pot odds you're offering your opponent. And the reason that we should use the ones that are more abundantly chosen for value is that we have more allocated slots for those sizes, because we have more value hands in there waiting to balance those bluffs. Here I would mix roughly evenly. I think we do have quite a lot of B33s, quite a lot of B75s, and some B150s. I think B75 would be a more frequent choice than B33 here for this hand, simply because our range can't use B33 as a bluff very often, because we're giving our opponent such good pot odds with that. Find 2 examples of value B150s that pool is unlikely to find. I strongly suspect that people will not think that 8s is a B150 here, but actually in blind versus blind nodes where turn is not bet, there aren't as many random big flushes floating about as it looks like. Because humans tend to process visually first and foremost, we're definitely overly perturbed by a runout that has 4 to a flush. That runout looks worse than it is. It's like a monsters under the bed kind of phenomenon. With pocket 8s, you can actually overbet here, and by the time you get up to having like a jack high flush and 9 high flush with unblockers to the pairs on the board, you'll note that when we don't hold an ace or a 10 in our hand, we're going bigger. And when we hold a hand like ace-9 with the 9 of spades, we're going smaller because we block the bluff catcher region. Villain can and should call one pair at some frequency here in order to stay protected. And so we just have a very good situation for range where we can overbet hands that don't seem that good. They're just high enough equity. If we look at the equity display for the in-position player here, we can see that a hand like a jack-high flush is actually coming in at 96%. That's enough to overbet. Our opponent would be leading many of their good flushes on the previous node. If we go back to that node for them, we can see that when they have a hand like the king-9, they're very often leading. The king-8, the king-7 of spades, very often leading. And same goes with their lower flushes too. Our range is quite condensed. We're not betting river that often, only like less than half the time, so they do have to do a lot of value betting with their good hands here to ensure that they make money. That leaves their range very capped. That's not a bad thing. For them, it's normal, but it is something that we need to react to. Explain why the solver never uses b400. The idea is that there'll be some nut flushes in our opponent's range checking, as we can see with like the king-9 of spades here. It doesn't happen super frequently, but it can happen. And what we see on a 4 flush run out is that by the time you start b400ing, what would actually happen here is that the hands that would call you would start to shift quite dramatically towards just having the king of spades, for example, or something like that. And the problem there would be that you don't really have any combos that you can value shove because only the king of spades is good enough for you to value shove on this node, and you don't want to do that because you block the calling range and don't really get called by enough worse hands. Whenever you see a really extreme texture like 4 straight, something like this, or 4 flush, you're generally not going to be able to go huge. You can go big and get called by loads of flushes here in this wide range spot, but if you go absolutely huge, you go for all of the marbles, it's not going to work because you're going to just shift your opponent's calling range too heavily towards the nuts. They do have it sometimes. Against some players, you could get away with that because they just never slow play the nuts here, but then there's another story of whether the spot's overfolded too heavily if you shove and all of these things. It's not even clear against someone that's more capped, that never slow plays the river, whether you would want to do this. On to question 3. This question asks us to have a look at a situation where we make a flop c-bet and have the chance to then bet the turn. We're going to have a look at the difference in bluffing between two hands that look quite similar here but aren't. Why is one a frequent bet and the other one often a check in the sim? Explain the solver's approach to the 7-6 of diamonds. Is it bluffing this hand? Why not? Why is 5-4 of spades a higher EV bet on the turn than the other 5-4 combos? And finally, describe the reasons for 9-7 of spades playing the way it does. Okay, so let's get into this. Again, what I've done here is I've simplified the sim to just using overbetting. I think this is easier than letting it do a weird, like, smaller bet at some small and meaningless frequency. Let's not include that. So we've subtreed here just to tidy up. And we have question A, compare the difference in bluffing king 6 of spades and queen 6 of spades. Let's have a look at one view you could actually use here would be the compare actions view. You could stick this on and say, okay, this maybe makes it a bit clearer. King 6 of spades seems to be the same EV betting and checking, but queen 6 is favoring checking. As you can see, there's basically no gain there for king 6 of spades. In the bottom right, it says plus 0.15. That's nothing, but queen 6 is 0.64, much more in favor of checking. Why is this? To understand this, what we need to do is look at the node that comes next. The very next thing that happens after we bet is that villain reacts to that bet. That's really where we need to go to investigate this. And what we can see here is a hand like ace-queen is actually really prevalent, and it's a very, very common fold in our opponent's range. We're blocking that with the queen 6, but we're not blocking that with the king 6. To explain this in one sentence, queen 6 just naturally and inherently blocks more of our opponent's folds than king 6, because while our opponent 3-bets ace-king all of the time here, they don't 3-bet ace-queen that often. So ace-queen is in there, it's making it to the spot, and it's folding. Part B asks us to explain the solver's approach to the 7-6 of diamonds. This is a hand that pure checks, it doesn't bet, and if it did bet, it would lose a few chips. And the problem with this hand is it's just awful, it's trash. That's not why it can't bet though, because there's some trash here you will be able to bet. If you search hard enough, you'll find some pretty goofy looking bets like the king 3 of clubs. So we don't want to jump to the conclusion that trash is the only reason this hand isn't betting. But it's because it's the sort of trash that actually blocks folding range. When you go ahead and bet the flop here, your opponent's going to have some diamond combos that are going to be folding that contain these cards at some frequency. For example, the 7-5 of diamonds is getting here a lot and that hand is pitching at a high frequency. The king 5 of diamonds is getting here a lot and pitching at a high frequency. We don't have a 5 in our hand here, but you get the point. It's to do with the diamonds being backdoor hands that call flop and fold turn at decent frequency. The 7 of diamonds in particular seems to be the culprit card. A hand like 10-7 of diamonds being blocked by this card. We really want villain to have the bad 10x plus diamond that they called flop with, and therefore having this card is just bad. You'll note that villain didn't get here with the clubs. When it comes to 10-7, they folded that immediately on the flop. They don't have that combo, but they do have the ones with the backdoors. This illuminates a common pattern in GTO, which is that when you block backdoors, it's actually going to be a lot worse for you, and you should expect a bit less fold equity when that's the case. This is a decent world for range, like clearly we're landing here with a big EV advantage. That doesn't mean we can bluff everything though. There may still be some outlier combos that are too horrible in terms of blockers to bluff. They're basically tier 7 hands, we would say. Bad bluffs. Why is 5-4 suited in spades a higher EV bet than 5-4 in other suits? First off, is that true? Yes, we can bet spades in this sim, but we can't bet the other ones. The reason for this is that when villain calls the flop, again, it's to do with the backdoor draws. They're not going to call 5-4 of spades, which is good, because 5-4 of spades, if they did have it, would fold the turn. With 5-4 of spades, we unblock their other 5x combos that would have called the flop, which would be the clubs and diamonds, the ones with the backdoors. When backdoor draws miss, they actually become a big part of your opponent's folding range on the next street, even when they have a pair sometimes. Finally, describe the reasons for 9-7 of spades playing the way it does. This is another hand that pure checks. It's similar. What we're really doing with this hand is unblocking the raising range and causing us to be raised at higher frequency. When we bet here, villain's main raises are going to be in the form of like king 9, things of this nature. They're going to be value hands obviously as well, which we can't block here. I thought king queen was going to do more raising than this, but it doesn't really. I think the main problem is just, again, we're blocking folds by blocking this region that's slightly underneath the board, blocking the pocket pairs that fold, blocking like the 10-9, 10-7 that would fold, that kind of thing, and also probably unblocking many of the bluff raises, though not all of them. This hand just looks like a hand that wants to realize equity. Now, you don't want to fall into the trap of saying, I check back to realize. That's not a reason to check back. You always realize equity when you check back. So in lots of spots, you don't just check for that reason. That doesn't make sense. But in situations where your blockers just ensure that your opponent continues more frequently than average, that's where you might want to favor checking back to realize equity, because the other side of the coin, the fold equity, is less good than normal. In question 4, our job is to reproduce the 5 parts of the checking range that we saw in this grade of the Carrot Poker School and assess their new class on the following turn cards. So we're going to basically give them a class on the flop and then have a look at what happens to them on each of the 3 turn cards here. Let's start off with the flop. Just to reiterate, the classes of hand that you want to raise on the flop in a wide range situation like this, where your opponent's basically betting everything, are going to be thick value, high EV draws or high EV bluffs, thin value, hybrids, and low EV bluffs. Here are some examples. On the flop, when we are raising with thick value, we could have any queen X, we could have a boat, pocket deuces, that sort of thing. We are facing a B33 here on the flop. It's a bit misleading that we don't always check raise deuces. You would think that we do, but these boats, these underboats, I guess you could call them, they tend to block calling range to some extent. Not as much when it's a deuce, but it's still an optional raise. Of course, it's fine. Then we have high EV bluffs. There aren't really any of these here. High EV bluff is just a category that doesn't exist on a board that affords so little way of improving when you don't have a made hand. So we'll leave this box blank. Then we come to thin value raises. This could be something like pocket 8s, which is an optional raise. You don't want to do it all the time, but it's totally fine. A hybrid would be a lower down hand. A hybrid could be something like 3s, which is mainly raising for denial, but has a little bit of a value element. You could also describe a hand like ace-5 offsuit as a hybrid, because look what happens here. You actually get called by a bunch of king high, king jacks, king 10s, things of this nature if villain is defending optimally here. This flop is so bone dry that our opponent really has to call super wide in this situation. What happens to these categories on various turn cards then? So let's say that he bets, we do raise, they call, and then the turn is the 7 of spades. The 7 of spades is a fairly bad card for our range. Whenever we're raising a range that contains a lot of low EV bluffs, and not many of those low EV bluffs get there, it's going to be fairly bad. Also, our hybrids are not really improving on this card frequently either, so this is definitely a situation that's going to favor our opponent. If we look at EV here, the out of position player only has 42.71% of the pot, which is pretty awful. This means that we're going to have to proceed with a lot of caution. The Judgmental Crows rule is going to say that we have to give up with a lot of our absolute air hands here. So when we look at our low EV bluffs, something like the 10-8 of hearts here, we can continue to bet with this because villain's range is so wide. This is actually a bit of a pair draw here. So that one doesn't have to give up. But when we have a hand like Jack 10 offsuit without the spade, we're going to block more of villain's folding range. So this is a hand that not only does it have not very much going on equity-wise, but it has negative blockers to villain's range because villain is going to be calling things like King 10, King Jack, Jack 10, Jack 9 of diamonds and hearts at a really high frequency and not calling with the spade combo. So having a spade is generally okay here. That would be the rule for how to choose which of your kind of low to medium EV bluffs you can continue blasting with. But remember that villain has a lot of ace high and king high here, so even when it looks like you have trash by holding a hand like king 5, you actually still have a couple of pair draws here, not just the king, but the 5 as well against their ace high and king high combos that 5's going to be live. It's not quite as hopeless as it looks to have a hand like this, but clearly we want to control our bet frequency here and not lose the plot and bet too often. Our really strong hands are still really strong hands here, like our Queen X can still value bet, but because we're out of position and urgency isn't super high, we can also do some slow playing with this region. And then when it comes down to what's happened to our hybrids now, let's have a look at a hand like pocket 3s. That's now become still a hybrid, I guess, it's just using a block bet. It can still get called by worse on such a brick turn by betting and get useful fold equity. It's kind of interesting if we bet 3s here. We don't really get better to fold, but we do still get called by King Jack a lot of the time because we're just making a very minimal investment. I think this spot's probably really overfolded if you block here in pool. I think people just aren't finding some of these really crazy looking defense. But that's what happens in really dry boards in wide range configurations, especially when you're using small sizing. And our low EV bluffs, as we say, are going to be mixing. Our thin value hands, interestingly now, are mostly checking. 8s is now too thin to value bet, but it's too high up to be a hybrid. It doesn't benefit enough from the fold equity, so it essentially just checks. Let's have a look at the deuce of hearts turn now. This turn inherently just looks really awful because any turn that helps ace high is just going to really be quite good for our opponent. That said, we have just made a bunch of bolts now with some of our hybrid raises like our deuce X, and also with our queen X has become like extremely invincible, so the fact that our queen can be out kicked now isn't really an issue. Equity wise though, this is still fairly bad for us, 45%, and we can't expect to be an equity favourite on a card like this. Let's go through our hand here. So again, mixed polarized strategy when you have a really good hand here like quads. You're unblocking your opponent's bolts that are going to bet and bluffs that are going to bet. You can feel pretty good about slow playing here, either by checking or B33ing with Queen X, same thing. You want to be betting a lot, of course, but you can also check sometimes, and generally urgency is never high enough on the turn out of position for you to be playing a fully polarized strategy. It'll be more mixed polarized, like mixing check-in with those bets. Then when we move down to our thin value region, 8s is still not really good enough. It's a bit better now because ace high has improved. It'll be calling turn a bit here, and pocket 8s in general is just going to be a bit stronger when things double pair up like this than it would be normally. And when we have a low EV bluff, again, we're going to be kind of selective here. We are able to keep blasting hands that don't look good, that are just pair draws, but we're going to pay particular attention to how many folds they unblock or block in our opponent's range. Again, not really looking to bet a hand like the Jack of Clubs 10 of Diamonds here. If we look at the EV of doing that, we can see there's a little bit of an EV loss. However, when we have a heart blocker, that helps us pick up more folds, and when we have a spade, that's really the important thing. The spade is the card that just unblocks the most of villain's backdoor hands that missed, and hearts aside, it's definitely the best suit of card to have here when bluffing. Let's look at the ace turn. So we remarked already that villain has quite a lot of ace X when they raise flop, much more than we do. And unsurprisingly, our EV is at the lowest it's ever going to be here, 40%. Now our hybrid hands like 5s, 4s, 3s from the flop just don't have enough going on to even consider betting here. They're actually just demoted to the point where they no longer count as a hybrid because not enough better hands fold, although now some will, and basically worse hands calling is no longer such a thing. Villain is mostly just calling with either worse hands that will bluff us later or hands that beat us. These hands are more just bluffs but not good enough to bluff with, and not low enough in showdown value to bluff with. They're basically tier 4. They're the median of our range and thus they check. When we have a value hand now, because our overall bet frequency is lower on this card than it was previously, we slow play more with our Queen X. Makes sense. Villain's also been a bit polarized by this card, and they're going to be betting some of the time with their ace X region, especially with a good kicker, as we can see there. Our formerly thin value hands like 8s are also demoted. They're just completely robust and more stable showdown value, so very easy checks and big mistakes to bet a hand like 8s here again. We need to make sure that we understand the concept of hybrid properly. And the only real hybrid hand I can imagine us having here would be nothing actually. I can't think of a hybrid on this spot. The spot's so unfavourable that I think we just want to be pretty conventional about things. Maybe King 10 is in some loose way a hybrid, but not really. I think it's just a bluff here. I think it's just been demoted. There aren't really any hybrids anymore, and the low EV bluffs are going to be deciding what to do based on their suit, as I said. Let's move on. In question 5, we are in a 3-bet pot this time, and we have a triple barrel being made by small blind, and we on the button have the chance to call or fold to this B70 all in. First question is a general one about theory, but it's relevant to the spot. Why is unblocking bluffs typically the most important part of whether you call a river bet in theory? How do we best unblock bluffs here, and which bluff catchers are folding due to a failure to do this effectively? Why is there such a dramatic EV loss from calling a hand like Jack 10 of Hearts that's linked to the above? And finally, this student, our player Clara, plays 50 NL and calls down with ace queen of diamonds in the spot, boasting a solver output in defense of her play. Look, the solver said I should do it, this is why I did it, I'm good. How do you coach her on this decision? In other words, how can we maybe gently advise Clara that copying solvers in spots like this may not be a great thing at 50 NL? Let's see. When seeking an explanation for part A, why is unblocking bluffs a good thing in general, or why is it the best way to go about bluff catching? We might want to stipulate that on flush runouts this is a bit different, where blocking value, that X factor as opposed to Y factor, may become more crucial. In general though, in blank textures and runouts that don't lend themselves to just one suit being massively better than the others, we're going to try to unblock bluffs for the following reason. While value hands are quite heterogeneous, they exist in lots of different shapes and sizes of kicker, and so it can be quite difficult to block one of villain's value bets with a side card more than others when people are just value betting all different kinds of, let's say, top pair, for example. Maybe not in this case where top pair is a bit thin, but in general top pair is a good example of a hand that value bets river that we struggle to block. And then here with two pair, the idea is, well, villain is going to shove two pair here, but how do we block two pair without just having an obvious call by having two pair ourselves? We can block one of those pairs, but then we're going to block some bluffs as well. So I think here, villain's bluffs are more going to be like Jack X, something with a 10, a queen, a jack in it, something of this nature. And so unblocking those hands is going to be way more of a patterned effect than trying to block two pair, because to really fully block two pair, you need to have two pair. Generally speaking, it's hard to block that value range without just having either a hand that's just really obviously a call anyway or is a value beater. And it's hard to do that when it's a one pair region because the kickers can be very diverse. And usually by blocking a kicker to one pair, you also block bluffs because that's a dangler, that's a card that's not on the board. And that evens itself out. Much better to think, what do villains' bluffs have in common? Is there a card that they share? They can be a lot more homogeneous, and therefore it can make sense to really target that region when you're constructing which hands to bluff catch with. How do we best unblock bluffs here? Well, when we look at what villain is actually choosing to bluff jam this river with, it's going to be a lot of hands of the nature of Jack 10, Queen Jack. This might be surprising to some of you, but in situations where villain has already filtered pre-flop, then again on the flop and the turn, and then the board is running out in this really hard to miss high wet way, pairs are going to be bluffs. There aren't enough air hands to go around. How does one even have air on this texture? Once you identify that theoretically your opponent should be bluffing a jack here really often, you stay the hell away from a jack when you're calling. That's good protocol. The way that we best unblock bluffs here is by not having that card. So when we look at our range and we look at what our pure calls are, our bluff catchers, that kind of thing, obviously we have hands that are just completely the nuts in there, but we really try to avoid having a hand like Ace 10, which is just one pair, not the best positive blockers and blocks the 10. King 10, similar thing, blocks the 10. That's a card that's bluffing really frequently. What do we end up calling? Well, we'd actually much rather call with a hand like Ace 5, because this unblocks bluffs really hard. Villain is not going to be bluffing here with the busted nut flush draw, not only because that's not generally a thing that you do, but because the ace is actually out there and it's a pair. We look at the EV of calling Ace 5 of spades, it's 0, but the EV of calling with a negative blocker is losing a big blind. So this will add up long term if we're not careful with our call selection. Why is there such a dramatic EV loss from calling Jack 10 of hearts? This is too big an EV loss. This is in percent pot actually, 22% pot. That's too big an EV loss to just be down to the blockers and it being a bad bluff catcher. The reason that this is a bad hand to call, like in particular, is that it's not a bluff catcher, it's a frail hand. Your opponent's bluffing with a hand like Queen Jack here, so you have that whole embarrassment of sometimes calling this hand and losing to a bluff as well as to a value hand. That's very bad. So we don't want to call frail hands to bets in the river. No. Big no. What do we say to Clara, who plays 50 NL and calls down with ace queen of diamonds? Well, the solver says you break an even, Clara, so does that mean you're doing okay? If you played 500 NL and you were playing against an end boss of poker, I would say, okay, more power to you, you're mixing, good. That's what you should do if you're indifferent or you're unsure, or you're trying to protect your strategy. The problem for a student like Clara is that she plays a stake that's full of people who don't know how to bluff this node. It's incredibly difficult to bluff enough here because the small blind player just has so many value bets available to them, and in my grade E course, which will be released as a video course at some point on carrotcorner.com, that's my exploitative course, it's very valuable, stay tuned for that. We actually see, here's a sneak tidbit for you guys working through grade 3, we actually see that triple Broadway boards are completely underbluff compared to other textures, like massively so. So Clara needs to overfold her range here, and she needs to fold every single bluff catcher in doing that, lest she's going to make calls that are theoretically break even, but hemorrhaging tons of money in practice. If you're ever wondering why you're copying GTO, but your line is going downwards in your graph, this is the sort of thing that could explain those phenomena. Let's move on to question 6. Here we have a big blind versus button spot where we check call flop and then have a river probe opportunity. We know that these are typically quite favourable worlds. Part A, why do B400 bluffs come in all different types of air combo? Why do we not have a more uniform way of selecting our bluffs? This is a tricky question, quite a tough one. Explain why using any size other than B400 with 7-4 of hearts is a blunder in Equilibrium, and is it also a blunder at 200 zoom on stars? If you don't know how that game plays, by the way, it's a fairly tough game. It's like the toughest zoom pool that runs regularly. It's to be avoided unless there's weaker players in there, I would say, for almost everyone. King 3 suited checks a lot more often than King 10. Why? And then B150 and B75 don't feature in this strategy. Why do they not feature? Let's go. Part A, why did the bluffs come from all different types of air combo? When we're looking at bluffing here, we can see that there are very many different kinds of hands that choose to bluff. These are value bets with the 4x, of course. So if we look at like the 5x region, so there's some Queen 5 going on there. There's some Jack 5, 8 5, 7 5, 6 5. It doesn't really matter what this side card is. It's able to mix bluff and it's doing it fairly frequently. And when we look at what villain is calling to B400, they're also calling really uniformly. The reason that we mix bluff between all of these different air combos evenly is that we don't want to give our opponent an incentive to imbalance their strategy to calling some blockers always and for profit and having to fold others because they would be losing. If we make it bad for villain to call with a hand like Ace-8 because we always bluff with the 8 and never with the 7 or the 9, then villain can now make a very winning call with Ace-9 and Ace-7 and just fold Ace-8 if we're always bluffing that hand but not the 7 or the 9. This is very meta, it's very theoretical, and it doesn't really come into play in practice, but I just want you guys to understand that's why solvers do this. They care about balanced long-term repercussions, and so they should, because their opponent, which is also themselves, sees everything they do. If you change your strategy 1 inch, your opponent sees it in Solverland. It's a horribly depressing place, to be honest. Explain why using any other sizing than B400 with a 7-4 of hearts is a blunder. Well, let's look at the EV difference first of all. There's a pretty big EV difference there, about 5% pot between that and the lower overbet. And if you were to go smaller here, B33 or B75, you suffer an enormous EV loss on this river probe opportunity node. What's happening? Well, it's basically Glutton theorem. This is not a spot where you can expect to get raised very often, because when your opponent checks back the turn, they just don't really have a 4, they don't really have a boat. The in-position player is so incentivized to value bet those hands there and then on the turn. That wouldn't be true for out of position, remember? When we get to this river with any random 4x hand, the solver's always jamming because it's saying mathematically and theoretically, the bigger I go, the more money I make. Even though you call me less often, it's still higher EV for me to basically maximize my magnitude of what I win and not care about the frequency with which you call me. There's a mathematical proof for that we looked at in grade 2. Now, what's happening here is that in some spots where villain is raising us a lot, we can sort of disregard Glutton theorem and greed theorem, and we can say, I'm going to go smaller here because I'll get raised a lot. That's okay, and it's probably okay with certain hands that are capable of going bigger in some spots due to their blockers, but the 4 here is going to unblock pretty much every bluff catcher because the bluff catchers are just evenly distributed in villain's range between different side cards, so whatever your 4x is, it's going to unblock a roughly similar amount of bluff catches in Equilibrium, and you're not getting raised a lot. You're not making back that extra money by being raised, so you really have to go all out here and go all in. You have to bet huge. I know it looks ridiculous in such a small pot, but if I gave the solver an even bigger sizing than B400 here, it would use that too. In fact, it might prefer it. I'm just trying to keep things a little bit more within the human sphere of familiarity for now. King 3 suited checks a lot more often than King 10. Villain will be bluffing a lot with a 10. A 3 is not a card that he gets here with, so we just want to go ahead and unblock more bluffs when we're checking. So it makes sense to block bet or check with this hand because we're going to induce more action. But when we have a hand like King 10, we're going to block the bluff, so it makes more sense to bet. B150 and B75 don't feature in the strategy. Why not? Very simple. We don't have any value hands that are good enough for B75 or B150 without being good enough for B400. And because we're not getting raised a lot if we B75 or B150, we stay away from those bet sizes. Just try to remember that your value region always drives your sizing. So if you don't have value tiers of tier 2 or tier 1, you don't use those sizes. We just have tier 3 or tier 0 here when we're value betting. On to question 7. This is a spot where we bet flop small as under the gun, B150 the turn, which is really standard in situations where our range gains large polarization / nut advantage. and our opponent in the big blind is very capped. This 3 does not uncap their range. And then we go for a different set of options on the river. We can check back here, we can B75, we can B150. This question asks us, compared to most river cards, how happy should Under the Gun's range be with this river and why? How does Under the Gun play the Queen 10 of clubs and why? And what is it about this situation that means Under the Gun has such a small showdown value checking behind range? We're very used to seeing people have quite a lot of hands that are just like, okay, I check back, it's tier 4, I have medium equity, so why does this not really exist to much of a degree here? And what plays can you find that you might previously miss once you understand this idea that you don't have a lot of showdown value checks? Let's see. Recall that when you're triple barreling, or you have the chance to triple barrel, I should say, you really aren't doing that well in EV. At best, you're in a neutral world for your range, and very often on many runouts, you're in an unfavourable one. But when a card comes like the 10 of Hearts, which completes every draw you can think of that's a straight draw, and there are no flush draws possible, your range has just received an enormous boost. In position's EV here is absolutely huge. In position is entitled to 83.18% of this pot. For someone who's triple barreling, that's basically unheard of. It's extreme, it's bizarre. If you've not studied a lot of GTO, I can't even stress how unusual this is to you. Believe you me, it's very, very weird. But the reason for it is that gut shots are a very abundant thing. When all of your gutters improve and all of your king-queen combos get there, and moreover your opponent didn't have that many straight draws because they couldn't just call an overbet on the turn with them. So when you get to this node here and you overbet the turn and you have this hand so frequently, king-queen offsuit, not just suited but offsuit, and then you overbet and your opponent's folded all of their king-queen and then king-queen gets there on the river, that's what catapults your range into this tremendously favourable situation. This means that not only do you have to bluff every time you have nothing, of course if you have something very low down here like a pair of 6s, you have to bluff, it's absolutely mandatory. Not bluffing here is terrible, but you even have to bluff some hands like Queen 10, hands that don't look like bets, but actually your range is so strong and these hands are so weak that the reason to answer part B now, that Queen 10 of clubs is a pure bet, is that it's higher EV. The fold equity is above the pot odds norm, so when you jam here, you're getting more fold equity. For 226, you're meant to get about 69%, 68%, you're getting 71%, that's why this play is inherently profitable. You can double check my math there, I might be off by 1%, but it's not important. This is an extremely bizarre situation. If we contrast this river to a blank one, you'll see that our EV now is only 42% of the pot, and now we don't dream of betting Queen 10. It's all about this river card. Don't consider bluffing just based on how you feel about it, whether you think they'll fold, or any of these things. You're making stuff up. Think about the texture, because when that river is amazing for your range, you have to triple barrel insanely often as a bluff due to how many value combos you've just gleaned that your opponent doesn't have. Part C, what is it about the situation that means Under the Gun has such a small showdown value checking behind range? When your range gets really strong and you just flood your range with value combos, if we go back to this 10 of Hearts river, what's happening is that hands that would have been showdown value or maybe just give ups on blanked runouts now become bluffs. So your hands now need to have far more showdown value in order to qualify for checking, because the fold equity is higher and betting as a bluff is better. It's not until we get up to something like ace queen ace king here that we can begin checking. We only check 28% of our range here, and that's actually just mostly ace king, because ace king offsuit is just so many combos. This is so much of our range. This is the only thing that counts as tier 4 here. By the time we're up at ace jack, we can start betting, and we're indifferent to jack 10. We don't really have a reason to go either way with that. It's just super thin, but we can do it. I wouldn't do this in reality because I think the spot's overfolded. I would check jack 10 here, and I would always bluff a hand like queen 9. The solver's like occasionally checking when it's diamonds. It's like, oh no, these blockers are bad, I don't care. I think in reality I should just bluff this all the time. Really weird and wonderful spot, and it really shows you that river texture can be extremely impactful to how you approach the next node. Hopefully that was useful. I think it's an instructive one. Question 8, another 3-bet pot now. Small blind against button and a delayed c-bet opportunity. Name 2 hands that seem like less intuitive checks here, and explain why they don't lose EV by checking. Why do we have such a high raise frequency after checking and facing a B33 in this spot? Reference 2 hands that must raise in your answer. And finally, why is the solver only using the largest sizing that I gave it, which is B120, in this spot? Okay, if you give it like B160, it might use that. If you give it B110, it might use that. Don't take this literally, guys. Don't be that person. This just means an overbet. That's all it means. Why does it like an overbet? Firstly, some hands that don't seem like very intuitive checks, but do check. Let's start with queens. I think this is a good example. Queens that doesn't have the eaters to the outs of the flush draw. I like to use this word, out eaters. Hands that eat up outs that your opponent needs to improve. And these are thicker value bets generally than ones that don't do that. So we bet queens when we have a heart and a diamond, and otherwise we don't. But what's really important here is that we check this hand a lot of the time. The reason we do this is that, of course, urgency isn't that high because our opponent will be opening quite a lot. So if we check here, they're betting more than half the time. And they have incentive to do that. They have hands now that are pure value bets, like pocket eights, which are also vulnerable and benefit somewhat from fold equity. And we're going to be able to check raise. That's the thing. It's not like when we check, we don't make any more money. People are very short-sighted sometimes in their thought process where they might think, I can't check, I have a value bet. But you can get value by checking as well. Like, what happens next? Checking doesn't equate to the end of the hand. While this can be counterintuitive, and you may just think, I want denial, I want value, I bet. Check raise is fine, and whenever you can check raise, you can usually bet. So queens is one. Another one would be something like the ace jack of diamonds. You might think that this one has to bet, and indeed if this gets lower and you have a frail flush draw, you do have to bet. Ace 8, ace 10, these ones are always betting, but even a hand like ace 7, it's so blocker dependent, and when I say have to bet here, you should really take it with a pinch of salt, because while ace 9 is always betting, the EV swing is just basically not that high from not betting there. It's not a huge deal, but the general theme will be that you can go for check jams or check calls with your flush draws too, depending on what kind of flush draw you have. When you get down to king high ones and have less showdown value, that starts to dissipate a little bit around king jack, king 10. But then again, like queen 10 of hearts is sometimes checking. So if I had to make this more computable to a human, I would just say that rarely, but sometimes it's okay to check your draw, villain bets, and then you just start raising with it. If you ever do check queen 10 of hearts, you raise. It's not a problem. You don't want to do it frequently because you only have limited slots available for check raises here. You don't want to put all of your draws into your check raise range, you want to bet them a lot, but this is fine as well. As long as you know that you have to check raise a lot of these hands after you check, you can check draws and you can also check queens. Why do we have such a high raise frequency after checking? Simple. Our range is much more polar than our opponent's range. We have all the overpair combos, they do not. So when they bet here and we have an overpair, we're very incentivized to raise, especially where villain can be betting hands with overcards as well as other draws against our hand. Because this is a two-tone turn, meaning there's only two suits and is therefore two flush draws possible, we do more raising than average because our opponent's range is more merged. They don't have as many low EV bluffs, they do have some, but they have more high EV bluffs like flush draws in relation to other textures. So raising is good. The more merged your opponent's range gets, the more big investments you want to make according to Clark's theorem, Carrot Poker School, grade 2, and when you're raising, you're basically making a larger investment instead of a smaller one. So that makes a lot of sense. It's all about polarization advantage and the gulf between the polarity of each range. Why is the solver using only B120? Same thing. It's the exact same reason. The reason that we only overbet here is that the only sizing that makes sense when you're value betting an extremely high EV value range and you're running out of time a bit here, because if you bet, villain isn't going to raise much. Okay, if you bet 33%, he only raises 13% of the time. If you B120, he raises almost never. You're not really relying on getting raised here to make money. So what you have to do is start building the pot so that your value hands, aka your overpairs, reach their investment ceiling, which is getting stacks in comfortably. Had you bet flop, you wouldn't have had to do this, but because the pot stagnated on the flop, that's why we've got to overbet the turn. Question 9 is a little bit more of an imaginary exercise. We don't have a specific sim or spot for this one, but we're going to try to name a flop texture on which you would fold less than 7% of the time to an R33. Remember, that's a range bet here in a 3-bet pot from the button. So this is going to have to be a really good board for your range, given that you're out of position in order for the fold equity to be that low theoretically. And why is your fold equity so low on that flop? Let's just do these one at a time. So part A, I think a texture where we would want to do this would be something like 7-6-4 with maybe a flush draw or maybe rainbow. If it's monotone, we probably fold more because that starts to redeem things for the 3-betters range, given that they have a lot of big cards, overpairs, that sort of thing. To understand why our fold frequency would be so low on a board like 7-5-4 two-tone, the idea would be that villain is not supposed to bet range there, and if they are betting range, they're really overstepping the mark in a situation where not only should we have just had a donk bet range because the board is better for us than it is for our opponent by far, but they should be checking back a very high percentage of the time if we checked. Part B, name a flop texture on which you would never raise. Let's go for like King 3-3, something like this where we just don't have any value region. The best hands we can have is something like King Queen, because of course we're 4-betting Ace King pre-flop here. King 3-3 is exactly the kind of board where villain has Ace King and aces and we don't, and therefore we have to ask what are we gaining by raising. It's not the case that we're not raising King 3-3 because we have a big range disadvantage. We do have a big range disadvantage, but that's okay. There are many flops we can build raising ranges on where our range is suffering. King Queen 5 two-tone, Ace 10 6, all of these kind of boards we do a lot of raising on. All we need to build a raising range in a 3-bet pot on the flop is some kind of nutted region, and if we don't have a nutted region, we don't have a raising range. It's that simple. Part C. Name a flop texture on which fold equity is around the pot odds norm. What factors contribute to this and how? Given that we're out of position, we'd need the flop to be a little bit favourable for us in order for this to be the case. So probably something like Queen 8-6, 8-7-3 two-tone. In fact, fold equity may be less there against a range bet because that's quite a bit better for us. But yeah, something in the middle, maybe something like 10-7-5. These kinds of boards, I would imagine. You could also maybe get some ace-high boards where this is the case too, something like Ace-6-4, Ace-7-6 two-tone, things of this nature. Anything that's a bit better for us here will mean that our EV is roughly 0, or roughly neutral compared to villains, and therefore we defend around the pot odds norm. If we were in position, we would need the answer to this question to be a flop that was actually a bit bad for us, because in position, there's always a bias towards over-defending relative to pot odds norm, and out of position, of course, there's a bias towards over-folding. So we do need a board that's a little bit good for us in order for this to be the case, but less so when villain bets range. When villain merges out and bets range, we don't need the flop to be that good for us in order to be meeting that MDF defense frequency, i.e. folding around the pot odds norm. Part D, for one of your answers above, pick a turn card that comes down after you've called and explain why a hand of your choice is raising as a hybrid of value and denial. This is a tricky question. I'll give you an example though. You might have a hand like 7-6 on 8-7-4, and you could call the flop, and the turn is a deuce. So it's now 8-7-4 deuce, and you check. And villain bet 60% pot, and you jam your 7-6. You jam your pair plus gutter. What's going on here? You have fold equity. That's very useful because you have a low pair on the board. You have a large value element because a nut flush draw with showdown value has to call you off in this spot. And you can also improve to win that way on the river. And I don't think there's any fold equity from better hands at that SPR, but you don't really need there to be because at low SPRs, it's very cheap to just stick the rest in and get very thin value / denial. You don't even need to be a favourite when called here. You just need to be in decent shape and benefiting a lot from the fold equity you get from jamming. Something like pair on the board plus straight draw, pocket pair plus straight draw. These are really common hybrid hands to be jamming on the turn. You can probably find other examples too, but low boards are going to yield the highest amount of hybrids in your range because your range is doing a bit better there and can combine vulnerable showdown value with redraw at the highest frequency, and therefore that's what hybrid is. That's the kind of thing a hybrid feeds off of, is vulnerable showdown value with good redraw. So 7-6 on 8-7-4 deuce is a good example. And finally, question 10. Can you explain the behavior of Ace of Hearts, Queen of Diamonds here? This is a 4-bet pot, and we're going to be betting turn or not out of position. We have the chance to bet turn on a pretty favourable card, the Queen of Clubs. Explain how Ace 4 of Spades is playing here, and how would you expect an average 100 NL reg to misplay this combo? I think it's always good as we move through the school to think about how our opponents are failing to apply theory. That helps us get the most bang for our buck in EV. And when you bet, raising is basically not a thing for button. Why is this? And finally, Queens is a pure check here. How do you explain why its strategy is so different from that of Kings? Ace of Hearts, Queen of Diamonds is still a value bet. When you look at its starting equity on this turn and factor in how little filtering has taken place, it comes in at 60%. In position, we'd probably want to check back such a hand and not reopen and risk getting jammed on, but here, given that the action is already open, it seems less important to have to do that. Out of position, we can definitely bet with a mixed assortment of thin value hands that are gaining a little bit of EV from fold equity, but mainly just surviving when called. Because villain is hardly ever raising here as well, it makes sense to just bet. If we do check, they're betting a lot more than they would be raising if we bet, so that's another thing. It's like a kind of blocker bet sense that we like to make this play. And what we can see here is that we are actually a dog, but that's okay because we're out of position. We didn't have a clean line in checking back and realizing equity anyway, so we can actually make these pseudo thin value bets / denial bets that are not favorites when called. The old school elementary definition of value betting that you need to be a favorite when called just doesn't apply to out of position spots because checking doesn't close the action. It's not such a good alternative. Explain how Ace 4 of Spades is playing. It's always bluffing, and it's going to be a slight mistake to check this hand. It's a really favourable world for your range. You have an overcard to the king, so you're actually live against the king jack and stuff. You can't say that for all too many hands here. There's only one overcard to the king, and when you have it, that's good. And you don't really have any showdown value with this ace high in this situation. The times we're winning river here are more from binking something rather than winning with ace high. Villain isn't going to allow us to do that here because they've filtered their range and they're going to be bluffing profitably with everything that would lose to ace 4 or chop with it. Ace 4 is betting turn a lot. How would I expect the 100 NL reg to perhaps misplay this hand? Probably be too pessimistic about the world they're in. Maybe not understand that they're in a world where their range has 58% EV. I mean, of course they won't know the exact percentage, nor do I, but they may not know it's favourable enough to start betting a ton of these hands. If you're in a bad world for your range out of position on the turn, that's where you have to start giving up such combos, but not here, and this is far from a terrible hand to bluff with. There's basically no hand in this situation that's too bad to bluff at some frequency. They're all fine, because the world is good. The fold equity is fine. When you bet 1/3 pot, villain is folding 30% of the time. That's way more than the pot odds norm. That's why it's good to bet hands that have nothing. When you bet, raising is basically not a thing for a button. I mean, it's a thing sometimes, but very infrequently. And the reason for this is the urgency is really low. It's a very polarized texture on which we're going to have some very clear call-offs and some very clear folds after we bet here. And so villain will not be making many hands in our range indifferent by jamming, therefore jamming is bad. If we were in a spot like double flush draw low board, villain would want to jam a lot. Remember our factors like lowness, wetness that we talked about for when to jam turns in lecture 10. Villain would then want to jam a lot because our range would be more mergy and they would make a lot of hands indifferent by jamming. But here they're not making that many hands indifferent when they jam, because basically we just either have really clear call-offs or hands that are just really like obviously a fold now that are nowhere near calling off. So if villain shoves, they're just overpaying for fold equity against our bad hands and not really making any hands indifferent at the top of our range. You can see the call EV for all of these hands against jam is positive. When we have a hand like ace queen, sure, that's being made somewhat indifferent, but even then not really. So jam is just not much of a spot unless it has more clout, more of an effective ability to reduce the EV of your opponent's range, and here it's just not doing that. The more polarized your opponent's range is, the less you want to jam. And this is quite a polarized texture for everybody. You just have a king, or you have two pair, or you have an overpair or ace king, and at this SPR, that's a strong enough hand that you just never consider folding to a shove. So what's the use? Also, you don't have to shove for value because you're in position with a low SPR. You can just wait until river, leave the bluffs in your opponent's range, bet the river when check to. If you want to, it's win-win. You also have the chance to bluff later too if you miss. Queens is a pure check. How do you explain its strategy? Well, Queens has very polarizing blockers. When you have a queen here, you're going to block the middle of your opponent's range. You're going to block hands like ace queen, and you're going to unblock top pair and bluffs. So your opponent's going to bet more frequently when you hold two queens than when you have two kings. This is a hand that's not slow playing as much because it unblocks a queen, which is a hand that could call you and check back, but wouldn't actually be betting itself very often. Hopefully that is a useful distinction between those two hands. Guys, thank you so much for taking the time to make it all the way through grade 3 of the Carrot Poker School. If you've done our full scholarship program and done this from grade 1, then mega congratulations. That's a hell of a journey, and I hope it's turned your game around in the best possible way. Stay tuned for lots more content from me, Pete Clark, on YouTube, on Twitch, and also more courses coming your way very soon at carrotcorner.com. I'd love to hear your feedback. I'd love to hear what you think about the Carrot Poker School. So I hope to chat to you soon on our Discord group or somewhere else. Hit me up, get in touch. Let's not be strangers. I hope we can work together again soon. There'll be more courses in the future. See you guys soon. Good luck at the tables and have fun applying this material. Bye for now.